Her life had become quiet in a way she never expected. Not peaceful, not restful, but silent in a way that lingered. The kind of silence that settles when answers stop arriving, when effort no longer produces echo, and when time seems to move forward without acknowledging your presence. Days passed without disruption. There was no dramatic loss, no visible collapse, nothing that could be easily named. Yet something inside her felt paused, as if life itself had lowered its volume and left her alone with her thoughts. She moved through her routines carefully, almost gently, as though making too much noise might confirm what she feared most, that nothing was responding anymore. She wasn't unhappy in an obvious way. She smiled when expected, showed up when required, fulfilled what was asked of her. But beneath that surface lived a quiet ache, the feeling of being unseen by the very life she was trying to participate in. She wondered when her voice had become so small, and why it no longer felt safe to speak loudly to the future. There were moments when she questioned whether silence meant failure. Whether the absence of signs was a message in itself. She had trusted, adjusted, waited. She had done everything she knew how to do, and still the quiet remained, steady and unmoved. At night, the stillness felt louder. Without distractions, her thoughts filled the space, replaying moments when she believed something would finally shift. Moments when effort felt close to being answered. Moments when timing seemed to promise more than it delivered. She didn't ask for much anymore. Not because she lacked desire, but because hope had begun to feel heavy when it lingered unanswered. Silence had taught her to expect less, to speak softly to life, to stop asking questions that never seemed to receive replies. Yet even within that silence, something remained awake. A subtle awareness that life had not ended, only paused. A sense that stillness might be carrying meaning she had not yet learned how to hear. She stood inside that quiet with a patience she didn't know she possessed, carrying uncertainty with grace even when it felt undeserved, trusting without visible reward. She had no idea that this silence was not neglect or absence. It was preparation. Because sometimes, before the universe responds, it grows very quiet, gathering everything it needs to roar in your favor. As the silence continued, it began to feel heavier, not because it was loud, but because it was constant. Days blended into one another, and the absence of response slowly shaped how she moved through her life. She no longer expected life to meet her halfway. She simply kept going, quietly, without complaint. There was a loneliness in that quiet that had nothing to do with being physically alone. It was the loneliness of effort without acknowledgement, of intention without reflection. She felt as though she were speaking into an open space that never answered back, and over time, she learned to speak less. She noticed how her inner world had grown careful. Dreams felt smaller now, not because they had disappeared, but because she had learned to protect herself from disappointment. Silence had taught her restraint, patience, and endurance, but it had also taught her to doubt whether she was being heard at all. There were moments when discouragement settled in gently, almost politely. It didn't overwhelm her. It simply reminded her that nothing had changed yet. That reminder followed her through ordinary days, shaping how she interpreted every pause and delay. If you've ever lived inside a season like this, you may recognize it. A season where nothing goes wrong, but nothing moves forward either. Where life feels suspended, waiting for a signal that never arrives. If this touches something inside you, take a moment and comment the word silence below, not as defeat, but as recognition. She wondered how many people were carrying this same quiet weight without naming it. How many were moving forward without knowing if anyone or anything was listening. The thought connected her to something larger than herself, even if it didn't immediately comfort her. If you feel seen in this moment, you're invited to stay. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving stories like this, reflections meant to accompany you through seasons that feel quiet, uncertain, and deeply human. She also thought of those who might be carrying their silence alone, unsure whether it mattered. If someone comes to mind, share this video with them. Sometimes, recognition arrives through shared experience. She didn't know it yet, but even acknowledging the silence had begun to shift something within her. Life had not responded outwardly, but inwardly, a door had opened. And that opening would soon change everything. She remained in the quiet, unaware that it was not the end of the conversation. It was the pause before the answer. As time passed, she became more aware of how invisible she felt within her own life. It wasn't that she lacked presence, but that her presence seemed to leave no trace. Effort dissolved into routine. Intention dissolved into waiting. And the silence remained, steady and unmoved. She remembered moments when she had believed something was about to change. Small signs that once felt promising, conversations that hinted at possibility, opportunities that seemed close enough to touch. Each one had faded quietly, leaving her with the uncomfortable task of adjusting her expectations once again. The doors that stayed closed didn't slam. They simply never opened. That subtlety made the disappointment harder to name. There was no clear ending, no obvious rejection, just the ongoing experience of standing before something that never responded. She carried this invisibility with composure. Few people knew how heavy it felt to keep showing up without confirmation. How tiring it was to continue investing energy into a life that seemed to offer no feedback in return. There were moments when she questioned whether she had missed something essential. Whether she had misunderstood the timing, the direction, or even herself. The silence made every doubt feel plausible, even the ones she didn't want to entertain. She noticed how carefully she now moved through her hopes. She no longer allowed herself to want things fully. Desire felt risky in a quiet world, where nothing promised to answer back. So she learned to want gently, cautiously, as if lowering her expectations might soften the eventual disappointment. Have you ever felt this too? Have you ever continued forward without knowing whether your effort mattered, whether your presence was felt, whether your voice carried weight beyond yourself? She asked herself those questions in moments of stillness, not searching for answers, but acknowledging the weight she carried. There was honesty in that acknowledgement, even if it didn't yet bring relief. She sensed that this season of silence was shaping her in ways she could not yet see. It was teaching her endurance, patience, and restraint, even as it tested her faith in being seen. She had no way of knowing that this very invisibility was preparing her for something louder than she could imagine. That the silence she stood within was not the absence of response, but the gathering of one. Over time, waiting stopped feeling temporary and began to feel structural, as if it had woven itself into the shape of her days. She no longer marked time by milestones or expectations, but by endurance. Each day was completed quietly, carefully, without asking too much of what came next. She learned how to stay composed inside uncertainty. How to remain polite with disappointment. How to keep going even when nothing confirmed that going mattered. This ability became her strength, even as it slowly asked for a cost she didn't yet understand. The silence around her was not hostile. It was indifferent. And that indifference was harder to negotiate than resistance would have been. There was nothing to push against, nothing to challenge, nothing to overcome. Only the steady absence of response. She noticed how often she reassured others that things would work out, even when she herself no longer knew what that meant. Encouragement came easily for everyone else. For herself, it felt fragile, as if hope needed to be handled carefully so it wouldn't break. In moments of reflection, she wondered whether she had mistaken patience for stagnation. Whether staying still had slowly turned into staying unseen. These thoughts didn't accuse her. They simply lingered, asking to be acknowledged. She became skilled at finding meaning in small, manageable places. A completed task. A quiet evening. A sense of order amid uncertainty. These small anchors helped her remain upright when larger answers felt unreachable. Yet beneath that stability lived a deeper question she rarely voiced. How long could silence last before it changed the person listening to it? How much waiting could a heart hold before it began to forget its own voice? She didn't dramatize these questions. She carried them calmly, responsibly, the way she carried everything else. Silence had taught her how to be strong without being loud, how to endure without demanding recognition. Still, something within her resisted becoming permanent quiet. A subtle awareness that waiting was not her destination, only her current terrain. That silence, no matter how long it lasted, could not erase what was meant to emerge. She stood there, patient and steady, unaware that the universe was not ignoring her. It was rearranging itself. And soon, the quiet would give way to something unmistakable. Endurance had become second nature to her, but it carried a cost she rarely acknowledged. Holding herself together without response required a constant inner negotiation. She learned how to stay functional even when motivation thinned, how to move forward without clarity, how to keep faith without feedback. There were moments when she felt proud of that strength. It had carried her through days that would have stopped others. Yet there were also moments when she felt the weight of it press against her chest, asking how long she could remain composed without being met. She noticed how her inner dialogue had softened over time, not out of peace, but out of caution. She spoke to herself gently, avoiding questions that might stir disappointment. This gentleness kept her steady, but it also kept parts of her quiet. The silence had taught her discipline. It had refined her patience. But it had also blurred the line between acceptance and resignation. She wondered whether she had learned to wait well, or whether she had simply learned not to ask anymore. She didn't feel angry at life. That surprised her. There was no bitterness, no sense of injustice. Only a lingering curiosity about why her efforts seemed to disappear into stillness. Why movement did not create momentum. Why intention did not create response. She reflected on how often she had told herself that timing would reveal everything eventually. That reassurance had carried her far, but tonight it felt thin. Not wrong, just incomplete. As if timing itself were asking her to look more closely. In quieter moments, she sensed that something inside her wanted to speak again. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just honestly. A desire to re-enter the conversation with life rather than remain a careful observer. She recognized that endurance alone could not be the destination. It was a bridge, not a home. A season, not a sentence. That recognition stirred something small but significant within her. She didn't yet know what would come next. She only knew that silence had shaped her enough. Whatever followed would require something different from her than waiting. And somewhere beneath the stillness, beyond her awareness, the universe was shifting its weight. Preparing not to whisper, but to respond in a way she would finally hear. There came a moment when the silence stopped feeling neutral. It wasn't painful or dramatic, but it felt complete, as if it had reached the end of what it could hold. She couldn't point to a specific instant when this happened. It arrived gradually, as a knowing rather than an event, and once it settled, it changed how she listened to everything around her. The stillness no longer asked her to endure or wait patiently. Instead, it asked her to listen differently. Not for signs or outcomes, but for herself. The questions she had learned to keep quiet resurfaced gently, without accusation, inviting honesty rather than resolution. What had she muted to survive this season? What parts of her voice had softened out of habit rather than choice? For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to acknowledge that silence had shaped her deeply. It had refined her patience and strengthened her resilience, but it had also narrowed her expression. She had learned how to wait well, yet in doing so, she had slowly forgotten how to ask, how to expect, how to speak to life with openness rather than caution. This realization did not overwhelm her. It arrived calmly, with clarity instead of regret. She saw that endurance had protected her when nothing else could, but it was no longer what this moment required. Something inside her felt ready to move from containment into participation, even if the path forward was still unclear. She noticed a subtle shift in her inner posture. There was less bracing, less withdrawal. A quiet readiness replaced the careful restraint she had carried for so long. She didn't need to force confidence or manufacture hope. The readiness existed on its own, steady and grounded, asking only to be acknowledged. She understood then that waiting had never been the destination. It had been preparation. The silence had not been punishment or neglect, but a shaping force, creating space for a different kind of response. A response that would not arrive as a whisper. She didn't make demands of the universe. She didn't offer ultimatums or declarations. She simply allowed herself to be available again. That availability felt significant, as if it marked a return rather than a beginning. She didn't yet know how life would respond. She only knew that she was no longer listening from resignation. She was listening from alignment. And in that shift, the silence had finally served its purpose. After that internal shift, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt charged. As if something beneath the stillness had begun to move, slowly but deliberately. She couldn't explain it, but she sensed that the quiet she had lived inside for so long was no longer static. It carried momentum now. She noticed it first in the smallest ways. Her attention sharpened. Her intuition felt clearer. Thoughts that once looped endlessly now arrived with direction. Nothing extraordinary had happened yet, but her inner world felt reorganized, as if it had been waiting for her permission to realign. Moments that once felt neutral began to feel intentional. A phrase overheard at the right time. A pause that created space instead of frustration. An unexpected sense of certainty about something she had previously doubted. These were not answers, but signals. And she was finally listening without resistance. She realized that the universe rarely announces itself with noise at first. It begins with movement beneath the surface, testing whether you are ready to notice. This awareness didn't make her anxious. It grounded her. She trusted herself to recognize what mattered without needing everything to be explained. Her relationship with silence shifted again. It was no longer something she endured or analyzed. It became something she partnered with. She listened not for outcomes, but for alignment. That listening felt active rather than passive, engaged rather than resigned. She felt a calm confidence forming, not rooted in certainty, but in readiness. Whatever was coming did not need to be forced. She no longer felt the urge to hurry life along or brace herself against disappointment. She felt prepared to meet what arrived. Even her body responded to this change. Her movements felt more intentional. Her breath felt deeper. The tension she had normalized for so long no longer dictated her posture or pace. She occupied space differently, as if she had reclaimed her place within her own life. She sensed that the silence was no longer gathering energy. It had finished its work. What came next would not whisper. It would arrive with clarity, resonance, and unmistakable direction. She did not know how or when the universe would roar. She only knew that it had begun to move, and this time, it was moving in her favor. What followed did not arrive as a single moment, but as a sequence that felt intentional once she noticed it. The days began to carry a different texture, as if the air itself responded to her readiness. The silence that once felt unmoved now felt responsive, no longer distant, no longer indifferent. She became aware of how often life met her with subtle confirmation. A message that arrived at the exact moment her resolve wavered. A conversation that clarified what had felt confusing for months. An opportunity that appeared without her having to chase it. These moments did not demand interpretation. They simply landed with precision. She realized that what she was experiencing was not coincidence, but coherence. Things aligned not because she forced them, but because she was no longer resisting their arrival. Her internal shift had created space, and life seemed eager to fill it. The silence transformed before her eyes. It no longer felt like waiting. It felt like listening while something unfolded. She trusted that unfolding without anxiety, aware that whatever was forming did not require her control to exist. She noticed how differently she now responded to uncertainty. Instead of tightening, she remained open. Instead of preparing for disappointment, she stayed curious. That curiosity allowed her to see possibilities she would have dismissed before. Her confidence deepened, not as boldness, but as steadiness. She felt anchored in herself, grounded in the knowing that she could meet whatever came next without losing her center. That steadiness made everything feel more manageable, more intentional. She reflected on how long she had mistaken silence for stagnation. Now she saw it clearly. The quiet had been a container, holding everything in place until she was ready to receive it fully. Even the challenges that arose felt different. They no longer threatened her sense of direction. They informed it. Each obstacle carried clarity instead of doubt, guidance instead of resistance. She understood then that the universe had been responding all along. Not with noise, but with timing. And now that she was aligned, the responses felt unmistakable. The silence had not disappeared. It had transformed. And what replaced it carried a strength she could finally hear. The changes did not arrive as a sudden transformation, but they became impossible to ignore. Situations that once stalled began to move forward without resistance, as if an unseen hand had gently released the brakes. What had felt blocked for months now unfolded with a natural rhythm, one step leading clearly to the next. She noticed how support appeared in places she hadn't considered before. Help came without her asking. Opportunities emerged without her chasing. Even conversations shifted in tone, carrying clarity instead of uncertainty. These were not dramatic events, yet together they formed a pattern that felt deliberate. Her emotional landscape changed alongside these external movements. The constant tension she had lived with softened, replaced by a steady sense of trust. She no longer questioned whether she was moving in the right direction. She felt it. That feeling guided her choices more effectively than logic ever had. She became more decisive, not because she knew the outcome, but because she trusted her alignment. Decisions felt cleaner, less burdened by fear or overthinking. She moved forward without needing reassurance at every step, confident that course correction would come naturally if needed. The silence that once shaped her patience now revealed its purpose. It had prepared her to recognize movement without panic, progress without attachment, and expansion without losing her center. She understood that had the change arrived earlier, she might not have been ready to receive it fully. Even moments of uncertainty felt different now. They no longer signaled danger. They felt like pauses within motion rather than stops. This distinction changed how she interpreted everything around her. She realized that the universe had not simply begun to respond. It had begun to collaborate. Life no longer felt like something happening to her, but something unfolding with her participation. What moved her most was not how much had changed, but how naturally it was happening. There was no force, no urgency, no struggle. Only alignment expressing itself through steady momentum. She understood now that when the universe roars, it doesn't always do so through chaos. Sometimes, it roars through clarity, through ease, through doors opening so quietly that only those who are ready can hear them. As momentum continued to build, she noticed a profound change in how she related to herself. The constant inner questioning that once accompanied every step forward had quieted. She no longer asked whether she was allowed to want more or whether she was moving too soon. That hesitation had dissolved into a calm confidence that felt grounded rather than forced. She trusted her perceptions now. What felt right no longer needed to be justified, and what felt misaligned no longer required explanation. This clarity simplified her life in unexpected ways, allowing her to conserve energy instead of spending it on doubt. Decisions felt intuitive rather than heavy, guided by an inner steadiness she hadn't known before. She realized that confidence did not arrive as certainty about outcomes. It arrived as trust in her ability to remain aligned no matter what unfolded. This understanding freed her from the pressure to predict the future, allowing her to stay present and responsive rather than anxious or defensive. Her posture toward life shifted visibly. She spoke with more ease. She listened without tension. She occupied space without apology. These changes were subtle, but they carried weight. People responded differently to her now, sensing the grounded presence she embodied. She understood that the universe was not only opening doors externally. It was strengthening her internally, preparing her to walk through those doors without shrinking or second-guessing herself. That preparation felt just as significant as the opportunities themselves. Moments that once triggered uncertainty now invited curiosity. Instead of asking why something was happening, she asked how she was meant to meet it. This shift transformed challenges into information rather than threats. She felt gratitude rise naturally, not as a practiced habit, but as a spontaneous response to alignment. Even the silence she once feared now felt like an ally, reminding her of how far she had come and how clearly she could hear herself. She recognized that what she was experiencing was not luck or coincidence. It was resonance. Her inner state and her outer world were finally speaking the same language. And with that recognition, she stepped forward not with urgency, but with trust, knowing that the universe was no longer quiet, it was actively responding in her favor. What surprised her most was not the opportunities themselves, but the way support began to surround her without being requested. People offered help before she thought to ask. Resources appeared exactly when timing mattered. It felt as though life had shifted from testing her endurance to reinforcing her direction. She noticed how relationships adjusted naturally around her new alignment. Some connections deepened with ease, grounded in mutual respect and clarity. Others gently faded, no longer resonating with the person she had become. This didn't feel like loss. It felt like refinement. Her sense of belonging expanded beyond specific outcomes or roles. She felt connected to her path rather than dependent on validation. That independence didn't isolate her. It grounded her, allowing collaboration to feel like choice rather than necessity. She realized that being supported didn't require constant affirmation. It required alignment. Once she trusted her inner signal, life responded with coherence, placing the right people and opportunities along her path without forcing. Even challenges arrived differently now. They came with guidance embedded inside them, revealing next steps rather than confusion. She felt capable of meeting complexity without being overwhelmed, trusting that clarity would follow presence. She reflected on how long she had believed silence meant disinterest. Now she saw it clearly. The quiet had been calibration, preparing her to recognize support when it arrived without fanfare. Her gratitude deepened, not as obligation, but as recognition. She acknowledged the unseen cooperation that had been unfolding all along, finally visible because she was ready to receive it. She understood that when the universe roars in your favor, it doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes, it sounds like everything finally working together without resistance. What surprised her most was not the opportunities themselves, but the way support began to surround her without being requested. People offered help before she thought to ask. Resources appeared exactly when timing mattered. It felt as though life had shifted from testing her endurance to reinforcing her direction. She noticed how relationships adjusted naturally around her new alignment. Some connections deepened with ease, grounded in mutual respect and clarity. Others gently faded, no longer resonating with the person she had become. This didn't feel like loss. It felt like refinement. Her sense of belonging expanded beyond specific outcomes or roles. She felt connected to her path rather than dependent on validation. That independence didn't isolate her. It grounded her, allowing collaboration to feel like choice rather than necessity. She realized that being supported didn't require constant affirmation. It required alignment. Once she trusted her inner signal, life responded with coherence, placing the right people and opportunities along her path without forcing. Even challenges arrived differently now. They came with guidance embedded inside them, revealing next steps rather than confusion. She felt capable of meeting complexity without being overwhelmed, trusting that clarity would follow presence. She reflected on how long she had believed silence meant disinterest. Now she saw it clearly. The quiet had been calibration, preparing her to recognize support when it arrived without fanfare. Her gratitude deepened, not as obligation, but as recognition. She acknowledged the unseen cooperation that had been unfolding all along, finally visible because she was ready to receive it. She understood that when the universe roars in your favor, it doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes, it sounds like everything finally working together without resistance. As her inner world stabilized, the outer world responded with a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Expansion did not arrive as pressure or urgency. It unfolded with ease, as if life had been waiting for her to feel steady enough to move forward without being pulled off balance. Opportunities began to present themselves in ways that felt aligned rather than overwhelming. She didn't have to chase or convince. Invitations came through conversation, through timing, through moments that felt quietly orchestrated. Each step forward felt supported instead of uncertain. She noticed how much her perception had changed. Where she once saw risk, she now saw possibility. Where she once hesitated, she now felt clarity. This wasn't because the world had become safer, but because she trusted her ability to navigate it with presence and discernment. Her work, her relationships, and her daily decisions all began to reflect this new orientation. She chose with intention instead of fear. She engaged with curiosity instead of defensiveness. These choices, small on their own, created momentum that felt consistent and sustainable. She realized that the universe wasn't asking her to move faster. It was inviting her to move honestly. Expansion felt like a continuation of alignment rather than a departure from safety. That understanding allowed her to remain grounded even as things grew. She felt gratitude not only for what was arriving, but for how it was arriving. There was no chaos in the unfolding. No sense of being pushed beyond her capacity. Everything met her at the pace she was ready to receive. She understood then that true expansion does not require struggle. It requires availability. And once she became available without fear, life responded with generosity that felt earned rather than accidental. The silence that once defined her life now felt like a distant memory. Not forgotten, but integrated. It had prepared her for this phase, teaching her how to expand without losing herself. She moved forward with trust, knowing that the universe was no longer rearranging itself in the background. It was now moving alongside her, visibly and unmistakably, in her favor. As her inner world stabilized, the outer world responded with a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Expansion did not arrive as pressure or urgency. It unfolded with ease, as if life had been waiting for her to feel steady enough to move forward without being pulled off balance. Opportunities began to present themselves in ways that felt aligned rather than overwhelming. She didn't have to chase or convince. Invitations came through conversation, through timing, through moments that felt quietly orchestrated. Each step forward felt supported instead of uncertain. She noticed how much her perception had changed. Where she once saw risk, she now saw possibility. Where she once hesitated, she now felt clarity. This wasn't because the world had become safer, but because she trusted her ability to navigate it with presence and discernment. Her work, her relationships, and her daily decisions all began to reflect this new orientation. She chose with intention instead of fear. She engaged with curiosity instead of defensiveness. These choices, small on their own, created momentum that felt consistent and sustainable. She realized that the universe wasn't asking her to move faster. It was inviting her to move honestly. Expansion felt like a continuation of alignment rather than a departure from safety. That understanding allowed her to remain grounded even as things grew. She felt gratitude not only for what was arriving, but for how it was arriving. There was no chaos in the unfolding. No sense of being pushed beyond her capacity. Everything met her at the pace she was ready to receive. She understood then that true expansion does not require struggle. It requires availability. And once she became available without fear, life responded with generosity that felt earned rather than accidental. The silence that once defined her life now felt like a distant memory. Not forgotten, but integrated. It had prepared her for this phase, teaching her how to expand without losing herself. She moved forward with trust, knowing that the universe was no longer rearranging itself in the background. It was now moving alongside her, visibly and unmistakably, in her favor. What surprised her most was how calm everything felt once the universe had clearly responded. She had imagined that being met would feel overwhelming, perhaps even disorienting. Instead, it felt grounding. The roar she once imagined as noise arrived as steadiness, as a deep sense of support that did not shake her, but held her. She noticed how easily she now trusted momentum without needing to control it. Progress no longer triggered fear of loss or reversal. She moved forward without gripping outcomes, allowing success and expansion to pass through her without becoming her identity. This balance made everything feel sustainable rather than fragile. Her relationship with ambition changed. It was no longer fueled by urgency or comparison, but by resonance. She pursued what aligned rather than what impressed. This clarity protected her from burnout and kept her connected to the reasons she had begun in the first place. She reflected on how different this phase felt compared to the silence that came before. The quiet had demanded patience. The expansion demanded presence. Both had shaped her, but in different ways. She understood now that growth requires different qualities at different times, and she had honored each phase without abandoning herself. She noticed how her nervous system responded to this stability. There was less reactivity, less anticipation of loss. Her body trusted the ground beneath her now. That trust allowed her to rest even while moving forward, a balance she once believed was impossible. She no longer feared quiet moments either. Silence no longer signaled absence. It felt like integration, like space to recalibrate before the next movement. She carried both silence and expansion with the same respect, knowing each served a purpose. She understood that the universe did not roar once and then fall silent again. It had shifted into a rhythm she could feel consistently. Not dramatic, not unpredictable, but dependable in its support. And with that understanding, she stepped fully into this new phase, not as someone rescued by circumstance, but as someone aligned with her own power and timing. As her life continued to unfold with steadiness, she began to recognize something deeper settling within her. Purpose no longer felt like something she had to search for or define. It revealed itself through how she lived, how she chose, and how she responded to what arrived. There was a quiet confidence in knowing that meaning did not require constant explanation. She noticed how naturally her actions aligned with her values now. Decisions felt coherent, connected to something larger than immediate results. She no longer questioned whether she was on the right path. She trusted that her presence within the path was what mattered most. The sense of being guided did not feel external or mystical in the way she once imagined. It felt internal, embodied, grounded. She understood that guidance often arrives as clarity rather than instruction, as alignment rather than direction. That understanding made her feel capable rather than dependent. She reflected on how much energy she once spent trying to interpret signs in silence. Now, she no longer needed to decode life. She experienced it directly. Meaning revealed itself through engagement rather than analysis, through participation rather than waiting. Her confidence allowed her to support others without losing herself. She offered presence rather than solutions, listening rather than fixing. This grounded generosity became part of her expression, reinforcing the sense that her journey was no longer solitary or isolated. She recognized that purpose was not something that arrived once and stayed fixed. It evolved alongside her, responding to growth, refinement, and understanding. That fluidity felt reassuring rather than uncertain. Even moments of challenge now felt integrated into the larger movement of her life. They no longer disrupted her sense of direction. They informed it. Each difficulty carried insight rather than doubt, clarity rather than resistance. She understood that silence and response were no longer opposites. They worked together, shaping a life that felt intentional, responsive, and deeply lived. And as purpose quietly took its place within her, she felt ready for whatever expansion would follow, knowing that she no longer needed noise to confirm that the universe was moving in her favor. With distance, she began to see the silence that once defined her life through a new lens. What had felt empty now revealed itself as sacred. Not because it was pleasant, but because it had protected something fragile while it formed. The quiet had not diminished her voice, it had refined it. She reflected on how much of herself had been shaped in those quiet seasons. Her discernment. Her patience. Her capacity to remain present without external confirmation. These qualities had not been developed during moments of recognition or expansion, but during the long stretches when nothing seemed to respond. She understood now that the universe had not been testing her worth. It had been strengthening her foundation. The silence had been a training ground, teaching her how to stand steady without applause, how to trust alignment without evidence, how to remain open without guarantee. This realization softened her relationship with her past. She no longer wished the quiet away or questioned its necessity. She honored it. Without those seasons, the roar would have overwhelmed her. Without stillness, clarity would have lacked depth. She noticed how this understanding changed the way she spoke about her journey. There was no resentment, no urgency to justify her timing. She spoke with calm authority, grounded in experience rather than explanation. That grounded tone resonated deeply with others. She felt gratitude rise, not only for what had arrived, but for what had delayed. For the unanswered moments that taught her to listen inwardly. For the waiting that taught her to trust without visibility. For the silence that taught her to hear herself clearly. She realized that silence and response were not separate chapters. They were parts of the same movement. One prepared the ground. The other allowed growth to emerge. Together, they shaped a life that felt authentic rather than rushed. And with this clarity, she no longer feared quiet seasons returning. She trusted herself to recognize their purpose if they did. Silence was no longer something to escape. It was something she could enter with understanding. She carried this knowing forward, certain now that when the universe grows quiet, it is not forgetting you. It is listening, preparing, and aligning everything for the moment it responds in your favor. As her understanding deepened, she began to notice how her presence affected the spaces she entered. Rooms felt different when she arrived, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried coherence. Her calm was not passive, it was grounded, attentive, and quietly confident. People sensed it before they understood it. She listened more than she spoke, yet when she spoke, her words carried weight. They came from lived experience rather than theory, from integration rather than urgency. This made others pause, reflect, and respond differently. She no longer tried to be convincing. She simply showed up as herself. She realized that alignment has a ripple effect. When you are settled within yourself, the world adjusts around you. Conversations unfold more honestly. Opportunities surface more naturally. Resistance dissolves without confrontation. This wasn't something she forced. It happened because she was no longer fragmented. Her presence invited safety. Others felt seen without being analyzed, heard without being fixed. This was not a skill she had learned deliberately. It was the natural outcome of the silence she had honored and the response she had integrated. She noticed how easily she now held space for complexity. She didn't rush to resolve tension or avoid discomfort. She trusted that clarity would emerge when it was ready. This trust made her reliable, both to herself and to those around her. She reflected on how different this felt from the earlier silence. Back then, quiet had been something she endured alone. Now, stillness felt shared, spacious, generative. The same quality that once felt isolating had transformed into connection. She understood that the universe's roar was not only external movement. It was the way her presence now shaped interactions, environments, and outcomes. The response was not always loud, but it was consistent, unmistakable, and deeply aligned. This realization grounded her further. She no longer needed to look for confirmation outside of herself. The evidence lived in how life met her wherever she went. And as she continued forward, she carried this knowing with her: alignment doesn't just change circumstances. It changes atmosphere. It changes how life responds to your very presence. With everything now integrated, she noticed that the questions she once carried so heavily no longer arose. She no longer asked why things had taken so long or why the silence had lasted the way it did. The need to interrogate timing dissolved, replaced by understanding that felt embodied rather than intellectual. She reflected on how often she had believed that speed was proof of alignment. Now she knew better. What had unfolded in its own time carried stability, depth, and coherence. Nothing felt rushed or fragile. Everything felt rooted, capable of lasting beyond the moment. She saw clearly that had the response arrived earlier, she might not have been able to receive it without fear, without doubt, without self-sabotage. The delay had not been denial. It had been protection. That realization allowed her to forgive the waiting without romanticizing it. Her trust in timing extended beyond her own story. She stopped measuring her life against others, stopped interpreting delay as deficiency. Each path revealed itself according to readiness, not comparison. This understanding freed her from unnecessary pressure and quieted an old, familiar tension. She felt peace with the pace of her unfolding. Even the slower moments now felt purposeful. She trusted that what was meant to meet her would not miss her, and what passed by was never meant to stay. This trust grounded her in the present rather than pulling her into regret or anticipation. She understood that alignment is not about acceleration. It is about coherence. When inner readiness meets outer movement, timing no longer feels like an obstacle. It feels like support. She no longer needed to prove that the universe was on her side. She felt it in the steadiness of her days, in the ease of her decisions, in the way life responded without resistance. The silence, the roar, and everything in between now belonged to the same story. A story that no longer asked to be questioned, only lived. And with that clarity, she stepped forward without hurry, knowing that nothing in her journey had been late. It had been precise. Looking back now, she understood something that had once felt impossible to grasp. The silence had never been a mistake. The waiting had never been a punishment. Every quiet moment had been shaping her capacity to receive what would one day arrive with strength and clarity. Nothing had been wasted. She saw how patiently the universe had worked, not against her, but with her. Rearranging circumstances, refining timing, strengthening her foundation. The roar that finally came was not sudden. It was earned through alignment, through readiness, through her willingness to remain present even when nothing seemed to respond. She realized that the universe does not respond to force or urgency. It responds to coherence. When her inner world finally matched what she was asking for, life responded in a way that could no longer be ignored. Not as chaos, but as confirmation. The silence that once made her doubt herself now stood behind her as proof of her growth. She no longer feared quiet seasons. She trusted them. She knew they were preparing something, even when she could not yet see what that something was. Her story was no longer about waiting. It was about becoming. Becoming steady enough to hold what arrived. Becoming clear enough to recognize alignment. Becoming grounded enough to trust timing without resistance. And if this story has reached you now, it may not be by chance. Perhaps you are standing inside a quiet season of your own, wondering whether anything is listening. Perhaps you've learned to endure silence without knowing what it is shaping within you. This is your reminder that silence is not absence. It is preparation. And when the universe responds, it does so with precision, not delay. What is meant for you will arrive when you are ready to receive it fully. If this message resonated with you, leave a word in the comments that represents what you are opening yourself to, subscribe to stay connected to stories like this, and share this video with someone who may be waiting inside their own quiet season. The universe does not forget those who listen deeply. Sometimes, it grows quiet. Just before it roars in your favor.